There you go. How are you, Clinton? We met before as well, haven't we?
We did, yeah. No, I'm good, thank you. I'm actually I was saying Pankaj before. I'm in South Africa on holiday, and so
Nice.
it's summery 28 degrees here.
Nice.
I get to be in short sleeves.
Yeah, it's taken a real cold dip here. Yesterday and today are in the sub-zeros. So.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, again, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining this session today. As you may know already, we are EthAum Venture Partners, a deep tech revenue accelerator and fund based in Singapore. Faradai is one of our portfolio startups, and that's the reason that we are hosting a thought leadership panel on net zero today. We have Edward with us, and obviously Clinton and Matthew. So what I would request is, I would request our panelists to do a brief intro of their of themselves, and then obviously Edward will briefly talk about Faradai, and then we will get into interesting questions and insightful answers. So I would start with Clinton.
Sure. Hi, yeah, so Clinton van der Spuy. I work as a consultant in ESG and sustainable finance. Most of my career has been in financial services, primarily capital markets, risk management, and then latterly climate risk. I think I was previously head of Rabobank's North America risk management financial markets, head for the Americas, as well as a board member of Rabo Securities, and then head of the climate risk working group for North America.
Thanks a lot, Clinton. Matthew?
Sure.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Matt Bullivant. I am Director of ESG Strategy at Oak North. So Oak North are a UK growth business lender. And we were one of the very first banks in the UK to be granted a UK banking license back in 2015 for over 150 years. And we are a fintech data-driven lender with our own credit intelligence software. And as part of that, climate transition risk modeling and assessment software for other banks and ourselves in our lending and our commercial books. We ourselves have a 2035 net zero target for everything we do, including everything that we finance. So it's a hot topic for us.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks a lot, Clinton. Edward, do you want to talk about yourself and Faradai?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks for hosting, Pankaj. So yeah, I'm Edward. I'm the Global Sales Director at Faradai. And Faradai are a UK headquartered software company helping organizations to accelerate their net zero ambitions by digitizing some of their processes. So we have a carbon accounting platform that helps organizations to efficiently capture their emissions data, organize and manage that data through helping them actually calculate their footprint by linking through with some library of emissions factors. And then we have target setting modules and offsetting platform. And we also have a energy monitoring platform that can actually really get under the skin of your scope 1 and scope 2 energy usage, help you understand that data better, and then we run analytics to provide actionable insights to actually help you reduce emissions as well. So kind of touching on the footprinting side, but also actively helping to kind of decarbonize organizations. So yeah, that's a bit about me. Great to have you guys. Thanks to Clinton and Matt for joining us today. Should I kick off with some questions, Pankaj?
Let's go ahead and get some insights from the experts.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so first question I'm going to kick off with is, what are the challenges or restrictions that are creating hurdles in achieving net zero? So, you know, just a small bite-sized question to start with. I'll chuck that one at you, Matt, to start with, and you can give us some of your thoughts.
Thank you. I think, I mean, I'll pick on one strand that strikes me every time kind of that sort of question comes up. And for me, bluntly, the pace of change just probably isn't fast enough right now. And I think that in itself is one of the biggest challenges we've got in terms of achieving net zero. There's a lot of focus since Paris 2015 around 2050, but we all know now that actually if we're going to hit net zero by 2050, we've got an awful lot of work to do between now and 2030. Otherwise, those sort of targets fall away. And I think that realization is there now that that it's about making those kind of deep cuts, those significant changes in the short term in order to hit those net zero goals in the slightly longer term. If I think about the UK and I think about if I think about buildings, which are a huge part of the kind of decarbonisation journey that we need to go on. So I think the energy efficiency ratings of a lot of the buildings in the UK government wants all those to be what we have as EPCs, energy efficiency ratings of C or above by 2035, 100% of them. We're at about 29% at that standard right now. So we've got a heck of a long way to go. And with the sort of push towards decarbonisation, things like installation of heat pumps, for example. I think with those sort of targets of around kind of 400,000 a year by 2028 in order to decarbonise our heating, we're installing about 6% of that right now on an annual basis, which is way short of where we need to be. Insulation's even worse. I think that's at about 3% of the level it needs to be at to hit those targets. So part of the problem there is retrofit of properties. That's a real headache, and a lot of the kind of support schemes that are out there are geared towards either social housing or low-income households, understandably, and exactly where that should be. But it means that there's a vast amount of untapped change that needs to happen from a net zero point of view there. And I guess it would be remiss of me not to mention the current macroeconomic environment, which is a hurdle to the net zero agenda. On the one hand, it does elevate the value of renewables and not having fossil fuel reliance, but on the other hand, it causes a rush to instantly, quickly available alternative fossil fuel energy supplies. So it's a bit of a conflicted environment. Of course, the irony being is that if we were all energy efficient to the max, then we wouldn't necessarily need to worry so much about the source of where that energy was coming from. But that's a slightly unstructured few thoughts that come to my mind, Ed.
No, that's brilliant, Matt. Thanks very much. And I think that pace of change point is, it's kind of the elephant in the room. We're doing some work. We're a signatory for the UN Carbon-Free Energy Compact. And one of the presentations that we received recently showed the breakdown globally of fuel usage, fossil fuel, solar, wind, over time, over the last kind of 20 years. And it's really quite shocking to see how little in some of those areas there have been changes. As the demand has increased, our fossil fuel, is not even that much less than it was, say 10 years ago in terms of overall usage, which is quite scary. So that's useful. Great stuff. Thank you, Matt. Clinton, any bits you'd like to add to that?
Sure, and I guess I take a more US-centric view here. I think for me, the key first item is the lack of, or maybe more limited use of, an enforceable carbon price in the private sector, so by way of a tax or emissions limits. I mean, there is stuff going on in the generation sector, of course, but more broadly not. I think well, for governments, we have the social cost of carbon on a federal and in some states we have those levels as well, but they're often well below levels, which are assessed, I think, by other stakeholders. The federal government, I think, currently assesses the social cost of carbon at $51 a ton, whereas I think University of California, Berkeley recently estimated 168 as a minimum level. So if we're not able to properly assess the cost of these emissions, I think it's more challenging to encourage development and upgrade and change. And then, of course, the US as well being so decentralized, you've got these varying standards and requirements that change by jurisdiction, and I think makes it difficult to invest, and also can lead to regulatory arbitrage in terms of what sort of investments will happen. I think access to finance is also important, particularly for non-investment grade borrowers. So if we think about buildings again in New York City under Local Law 97, it could be 50,000 buildings are subject to the new regulation. The vast majority of those would be non-investment grade, or the owners or the borrowing capacity. So actually getting access to capital to make the investments required is a challenge in and of itself. The last item, which is not necessarily about achieving net zero, but maybe the meaningfulness of it, is just the use of offsets, where real mitigation is probably preferable. So we've still got largely unregulated, non-standard voluntary carbon markets. And so, sometimes when people are using these offsets, the veracity or integrity of those carbon credits is not always clear.
Yeah, that last point, Matt and I actually chatted about a bit last time we spoke, and in fact, talking about your area familiar in the States and in California, how the wildfires have really destroyed large numbers of offsetting things, and they'd planned for that to be their kind of residual capacity, knowing that not all of them will make the 100 years. And I think, what was it, in the first 5 years, that 100-year residual amount went in forest fires. So yeah, absolutely, that is a massive area that needs kind of some spotlight on it, I think. And there's definitely more work happening in that area, isn't there, to try and bring up the kind of level and quality of it. But I think just the scale of it at the moment, the number of kind of new projects coming out, makes it difficult to kind of get a hold of.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think looking at New York City again, they're quite strict in terms of the Local Law 97, well, what's allowed as an offset, and the offsets are quite limited as well. So I think from a regulatory perspective, you can really drive that as well. It's important to focus on regulating or providing standardization for these voluntary markets, but I think the entities that are capping carbon or charging taxes or fines on excess emissions can play a big role also in determining what sort of offsets are allowed.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So let's shift away from the kind of macro net zero into a bit more kind of looking around maybe energy management. So what are the innovations in energy management or sustainability that you guys are kind of particularly excited about?
Shall I go first? So I think in my mind, there's a lot to come around energy storage. I think we've now moved on in terms of there being readily available renewable sources, but actually how do we manage and smooth out the peaks and troughs of renewable generation? I think we're still behind on this, and we still have some way to go. And I think actually the scalability and practicality of renewables taking center stage, the storage and energy management of those sources still needs to happen. And I think there's some cool stuff out there. There's some real innovations around thermal storage. I was looking at molten salt the other day in terms of how much energy it actually retains and releases and doesn't lose in the process of recrystallization, which is very cool. There's advances in lithium battery tech and greater lifespan, greater efficiency in storage and re-release of energy there, which is great. I think as well, as the electric vehicle market grows, I think there's a lot more to come there in terms of vehicle to grid and slightly more agile use of energy energy sources, and I think that's part of the shift. Really, it's about treating energy as an asset rather than a cost, and how you can actually manage that. And I think there is a little bit to come, really, in terms of decentralization of power generation and control over kind of demand for energy, who generates it, trading it, passing it where it's needed. And there's some really interesting kind of developments in that sort of space. But of course, in doing that effectively, there's and not to trample on your domain, Ed, here, but there's a lot in smarter and smarter building energy management systems out there now. There's better sensors, real-time data, more granularity over the power sources that are being captured as part of all that. And we're moving into a space now where we've got predictive use capabilities. Systems that are switching off underutilized rooms and thinking about activity and capturing that data and relaying it into to energy use for sites. So, the world is becoming much more sophisticated into how it deals with energy management now, and I think that's quite exciting.
Yeah, go for it, Clinton.
Yeah, I was going to say it's been interesting for me being back in South Africa now. I haven't been here in 5 years, and it's obviously great seeing my family. But one of the things that has really struck me is the rolling blackouts that are happening here, and they've been going on for a few years now. And so when you talk about optimization, reliability, decentralization, all those issues are massive here, and driven less by the need to move to renewables, but more the unreliability of the existing generation plants. And so I think it's a real opportunity here in the US, and it's sort of driven by, I guess, just absolute need anyway, where individual businesses and on a retail level, people are installing batteries, are installing solar. Companies now are getting licenses to install their own wind or solar plants. And you have this sort of decentralization of the energy system potentially happening here in South Africa, which I guess for me is interesting because it just comes from the other angle where now your existing assets are unreliable rather than wanting to deal with emissions separately.
Yeah, it's kind of a fast forward to the future of many other countries. I think the South African kind of energy crisis it's seasonal, right? It's not kind of all the way through the year, it's just at certain times.
Well, no, it really depends on, they have these 12 plants which are quite unreliable, and depending on when they go down, it changes every day. And so yesterday, I think we had, 8 or 10 hours without power. Yeah. Today will be probably 6 or 8 hours without power, and it's every day at the moment. Really depending on whether there are issues with the coal feedstock, whether they're transmission issues, other generation issues. It's tough to manage, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, trying to run businesses and even families like that is not easy. I think one of the areas that being kind of into data and analytics, we see quite an exciting area around getting much more visibility about the carbon intensity of the grid at certain times of the day. And again, through the work we're doing with the UN Carbon for Energy Compact, they're kind of highlighting that there needs to be much greater visibility on this. So where you've got organizations who are purchasing green energy contracts, the reality is that actually at certain times of the day, in many cases, you are relying on fossil fuel to be able to power your building because there isn't sufficient renewables around. And I think a few areas of kind of development around there. It's actually a new area that we're looking at as an organization, being able to provide grid intensity data on an hour-by-hour basis, so that gives organizations the ability to, firstly, it's visibility. It's visibility. It creates that understanding. It becomes the norm and brings into society the reality that just because you buy green energy doesn't mean you're not relying on fossil fuel. And then it also allows that ability to be able to do something and take different actions with that information, which ultimately is going to increase investment in I say renewables, but also non fossil fuel energy. Cool. Okay, so what about, how do you see energy management space evolving in the next 5 years? We may have covered some of those, but if there's anything you wanted to add on that, Matt?
I guess slightly philosophically, I think the data is improving, and I think from a carbon point of view as well, we know how to measure and calculate that now. We just don't necessarily have an agreed approach as to what the right way of doing that is, which is still progress, and we've still got some way to go there. But there is greater levels of data, there is greater granularity, and we are kind of beginning to have more insight and more tactical approach to energy management and measurement. But I think what we're starting to see is, and what we'll need to see over the coming years, is a bit of a stitching together of various component parts, because for some time now it's been a case of how do we measure energy use accurately, or how do we manufacture an alternative for heating or lighting? How do we design a building for greater efficiency? But we only really make progress if all of those component parts work together. It's an ecosystem. It works in unison. And what we need to be able to do is measure energy use, identify tactically where to reduce it. We know the sort of tech that can solve for that, where to source it, how to install it. And now I think what we're thinking about isn't just carbon from a climate change point of view, but there's the whole biodiversity argument. There's, clean air, green spaces, the social aspect of, is it actually a nice, comfortable environment that we are working or living in? It is a much broader perception of actually where we're trying to get to with this, and all of those parts need to move together. And energy use now and energy management it's got to be part of the broader design and use consideration of buildings. I had a conversation with someone the other day who pointed out to me that we design buildings these days to function as they should when everything's switched on. And we really ought to be thinking about, how do we get a building how do we build to off? How do we get a building to do as it should when everything's switched off? Does it stay warm or stay cool? Does it have the right level of light during daylight hours when everything's switched off? And just to have that thought process around energy efficiency, which is an interesting perspective in terms of that. And the only other point I'd make really is that, it has to start to become the domain of individuals, not just large landlords or or real estate investment businesses. Homeowners need to become more educated and in tune with energy use. We've got to have solutions that are practical and affordable to retrofit housing stock at that level, which we don't have right now. And of course, SMEs, who often fall through the net. In the UK, they account for about 50% of our carbon footprint, but any measures out there tend to be targeted at either individuals or big corporates. So they need to be brought into the fold. And I can see that happening.
And, the good aspects of energy crisis is that there is certainly much more of a spotlight shining on those areas. I guess the bad side is actually then investment to make any changes is difficult. But I guess in all predictions of the best ways to reduce emissions from energy, there's been that aspect of human behavior change and actually limiting the amount that we're using, aren't we? So I think there's a small bit of hope that can be drawn from this situation we're in. Clinton.
Yeah, I think just coming back to New York, so we have this local law 97. Well, it's effective already. First reporting is due 2025 on 2024 emissions. But of course, the reduction targets are fixed already, and so companies are needing to invest. So from my perspective, you'll have this rush of investment coming over the next couple of years, and it will only grow. I think 25% of the housing stock that falls under the law won't meet targets without any investment by 2030. So not massive, but material. And of course, after that percentage just grows. And so if you tie that to the state's push towards renewables, decommissioning of a nuclear power plant, obviously needed investment in the grid, which is not super reliable, and tying that to federal legislation now, which is suddenly made heaps of money available for this type of investment. I think it's a golden age for energy and new energy across the spectrum. So not just in generation or use, but also in distribution and in any element that touches it, so that we can move away from emissions-based energy.
Yeah. I think when I typically think energy management from the kind of post-generation aspect, and so all the work that we do around monitoring and managing is kind of making the situation less bad. So we're dealing with percentages of 5 to 15, 20%, say, in reduction, and that correlates through to emissions. But really, in terms of doing something good, you need to look at that generation aspect, don't you? Otherwise, we're talking about, the pace of change is just never going to get there at 15% tweaks here and there.
Absolutely, and I think we also have that they have, well, as I said, there's a nuclear plant being decommissioned. They're wanting to decommission gas-fired plants, and so if you have the increased efficiency on in commercial real estate or in residential real estate, that supports the restructuring of your broader energy grid as well, and not needing to invest unnecessarily or unnecessarily early in new renewables infrastructure.
But yeah, be able to tweak what we've got. Okay, so what role does AI or ML, computer vision, augmented reality, blockchain, all these up to minute exciting new technologies, what do we think these are going to play in the disruption of this space? And I challenged Matt when we had a brief email back and forth to come up with something of, or for anyone to come up with augmented reality related to energy management. So bonus points for that, but we're not expecting it. Matt.
Yeah, I think it really would be an augmented reality if I had something insightful to say about augmented reality. So, I think this is stretching my kind of technical know-how to some extent around these slightly more sophisticated technologies. But I touched on some of it earlier. I think predictive capabilities around energy management, rather than relying on user inputs, is already happening to some extent. What we're seeing that with kind of smart thermostats and the like that track usage and what your behaviours are within a property, and I think that's obviously got a road ahead of it there. And I think there's a next step there with AI and machine learning driven decision making on energy use that takes it out of the hands of the users to a large extent in terms of managing that efficiency. I think there's a role there as well to kind of plug missing data. I think there is, in some instances, there's a lot of data that is already out there, but it's in the wrong hands. So if I finance a small business who don't disclose their energy use, but I need as a bank to calculate what the carbon impact of their operations are, well, the utility companies know what power is being used, but the data's with them and it doesn't belong to them. Yeah. So how do we bring all that together? And I think there's a real kind of big data solution there to data points that do exist, that are out there. They're just in the wrong place for us to manage energy efficiently. And of course, then there is missing data that is actually missing, that we would need to model rather than rely on anything actual out there. And that is all about dragging in equivalent or similar data points elsewhere that do exist, and just creating implied modeled outcomes there that we can actually have something tangible to act upon. So that's the way I think about those sort of technologies coming into play.
Yeah, good stuff. So Matt didn't manage augmented reality. Clinton, I'm going to challenge you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I too must demur. But I do like grid optimization, demand management for AI and machine learning. I mean, I think it exists now to some extent. I think it can become a lot more granular. And you think about incorporating battery storage or even manufacturing processes that can accelerate or decelerate based on availability of energy or energy prices. I think also on the blockchain side, it's interesting for offsets and carbon credits again. And so being able to track, verify, monitor your carbon credits. And so that helps I guess improve the reliability of the carbon credit market, or people's comfort with it, and it also opens up trading in carbon markets. Again, having said I prefer real abatement to offsets, but we know that we will need offsets to some extent anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So whilst you were both talking, I was thinking whether how I would talk about augmented reality, and I'm thinking from a consumer behavior position probably within the home. You've got some kind of way of displaying the financial cost of the energy that you're burning in the air jumping into your headset somehow. Not sure, but I tried. I mean, yeah, it's a bit more kind of in the area of us. So we are kind of big data people, and I think we see the value that comes from combining these kind of big data sets, so both granular energy data, but also non-energy data, things that can be used to kind of normalize those data sets, like, you know, square footage and area of buildings and things like that. And the granularity level of it means that methods like machine learning just make those processes much more efficient than if you're doing it, you know, in another way. So blockchain, again, I think when you're looking at purchasing of energy as well, so looking at potentially if you're arranging a procurement of energy on an hourly basis, so kind of building on this concept of once you've got that visibility over the intensity of the grid on an hourly basis, you can actually switch your annual PPAs to, you know, looking on an hourly type basis to ensure that you truly are buying green energy in the grid at that time. There's a couple of companies kind of looking at doing that. Yeah, that's probably all I'm going to add on that bit. So let's jump to this next question. So what could be the biggest hurdles or government-powered incentives in adoption or innovation solutions within this space? I'll go to you, Clinton, because I know you've been sort of talking quite a lot around kind of legislation.
Yeah, so I think the first one for me is, and not necessarily directly legislation, but it's sort of lack of certainty for investors. And COP27, there's a lot of talk about natural gas as a transition fuel. And it seemed as if a year ago, that discussion, I wouldn't say it was settled, but we were further along in discarding natural gas, and now it's come back to the forefront. Of course, it's not completely unexpected, right? So you have investors and asset owners that are trying to protect the value of those assets and extract every last cent. But I guess in a sense, I'd hope that we would be further along in dealing with that. And it seems as if certainly the issues in Europe related to natural gas haven't solved it as much as I would have thought, because now you're really building infrastructure to support global trading of liquefied natural gas. The US is exporting, obviously, Qatar, and so that entrenches us again in this emissions-based energy. The other side is also on advocacy, just more generally from asset owners who aren't looking to or looking to limit investment or delay investment. And so, for example, and I keep coming back to it, but it's one I know best, is Local Law 97 in New York, where the penalties for not meeting your emissions requirements are extremely steep. And so you have litigation ongoing now against the city to try and delay or dilute that legislation. And so I think to the extent that things aren't actually implemented and running, and those taxes aren't active and the costs aren't visible right now, there's still the risk of diluting the impact of anything that's pending.
Thank you, Clinton. Matt.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with everything Clinton's had to say there, and I echo a lot of that. I think that the clarity point is really important, and direction of travel, and I think regulation and government guidance has a really important role to play in steering that. And I don't think it's done a terribly good job of doing that, certainly not here yet. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're in quite a nascent space with new technologies, new solutions out there, and actually there's quite a few popping up, but in some senses it can impede progress because there's no clear winner. Nobody knows what to back, and we get lots of alternatives rather than a strong emphasis on an investment in something that materially pushes one thing in one particular direction. If I think about the UK kind of decarbonisation of heat, air source heat pumps versus hydrogen is a classic example of that push and pull debate that doesn't really have a proper answer yet, because some weight has been pushed behind heat pumps, but not really enough to do what we need to do there. But in the meantime, there are conversations still happening around hydrogen. So what's it going to be? And nobody knows. So that holds up proper investment and progress because we don't know which way to go. So I think, that clear guidance around, what's going to be accepted, what's going to be the right way to go with this, what's going to form part of a national decarbonisation strategy would help. And also from a finance point of view, grants, great, everybody wants a grant, but it does help when you've got something that's being promoted. And guarantees, we're not asking the public sector to finance all of this. The private sector will do it, provided that it can get over that risk hurdle, and actually government guarantees can facilitate that, and unlock a lot of private sector finance that at early stage just can't necessarily get past the obstacles of moving into what is a very new space. Because I think that proof of concept, and coming back to the very first question you asked around what's some of those hurdles around achieving net zero, the proof of concept is sometimes a little bit hard. The value of energy efficiency, we all know, more apparent than ever, but it doesn't cross the upfront investment issue, and that's still a challenge.
Yeah, I think that's right, and valuable insights. And I'm thinking again, right back to your comment at the beginning, Matt, with the pace of change. It doesn't seem that the legislation is accelerating quickly enough for the problem. And I used to say that I worked to help organizations reduce their impact on the environment, and now I'm saying I'm looking at how we can mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. It's that sort of difference that illustrates that kind of challenge that we have. But I think around reporting of emissions, we need something to be clearer, quicker. I think there's some mandatory reporting for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. The UK government, if you want to supply them with goods worth over 10 million, you have to report a subset of your scope 3 emissions. But things like that need to be increased. There needs to be greater pressure for organizations to do it, because the problem that everybody has is, how can I collect data on all my suppliers, because they don't have that information available. And obviously it's difficult because this is a global problem and supply chains are global, and you're asking organizations in the Philippines and China and all over for information. But I think as the UK government, we can do things a bit quicker, and then hopefully other countries can follow. I think France are quite strong in scope 3 legislation. They're this year or next year, I think, making more aspects of it mandatory, and I think that the old adage, if you can't improve what you don't measure, I think that means that's really kind of got to be a focus area for governments.
No, and it's the same in the US. There's no mandatory reporting in the scope 1, 2, or 3 at the moment, and we're still waiting for the ever imminent SEC disclosure rules to come into force. Which I think will really move the discussion forward, not only on emissions, but on physical risk as well.
Yeah. Okay, so last question. Name a few mistakes that startups are making while pitching their innovative solutions to you or other decision makers. So yes, Matt, go for it.
Yeah, So here's how I think about it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think any provider of finance is probably thinking about, in my mind, 3 things. 1, how does that solution drive the bottom line? What is it that solution gives in terms of competitive advantage or growth prospects, or why is it revenue generative and additive? So that's number 1. Number 2, how does it help them manage risk? So why is that solution actually not going to expose them to, a failure in that model in a few years' time, or competitive pressures that will wipe out the business model, or anything like that? How does it help as a finance provider manage risk? And thirdly, your hygiene factors. So is it regulatory compliant? Does it fulfill industry policies and standards? How does it fare against competitors in the same space? Is it at least at or above? And I think those are the kind of pillars that finance providers are kind of thinking about when they look at a solution. And I think what happens sometimes is there's a lack of thinking about what the end user of that solution is actually after, because sometimes it's a case of, does it pass the so what test? And it might seem obvious. It might be, well, this is going to help you decarbonize. Okay, great. And why, from an investment point of view, why that solution? Why not another? Why is that the one that's going to last? Why is that the particular solution for your target audience? Who are your target customer market for that? And why that versus anything else? And I think there's that articulation that sometimes doesn't get there. Sometimes it sticks at this is a great solution because it helps save energy or helps reduce carbon, and that's why we should be supporting it. Well, that is the right ethos. We need to go one step further there in terms of saying what actually is the end user getting out of this, and why is this the most effective rather than anything else? And from a finance provider's point of view, what do they do from a financial perspective in terms of bottom line, in terms of risk, in terms of compliance? And I think those are key.
Yeah,
I think Matt, I really agree with this distinction, which doesn't necessarily always happen between the moral imperative and sort of trying to save the world and the financial impact, because at the end of the day, this is about dollars and cents, right? And so the dollar payoff has to be visible upfront, either in money saved or penalties avoided. So the business case has to be evident from the beginning.
Good insight.
Something else I thought of, excuse me, Edward, but was just also not underestimating the value of incremental benefit. So not everything has to be a magic bullet, because I think in terms of solving this, we really need it's an all of the above kind of effort, right? So you don't have to have the one thing that's going to save the world, but every little bit can help. And to the extent people are facing legislation or regulation to meet certain targets, anything that helps incrementally get us there can be useful, as long as the business case, of course, is there as well.
Yeah, ultimately, the money still makes the world go round. But I guess that's, again, another incentive and reason for a true carbon tax that actually makes that slightly different. And then down the line, we'll get onto a social tax as well, perhaps. Cool. Okay, that's all our questions done. Any final thoughts anyone wants to add on net zero, sustainability, energy monitoring, technology, sustainability?
I mean, I think the opportunity is still absolutely vast. I think we have a tendency around climate to lean on the negatives and say, oh, it's doom and gloom. If we don't do X, then the world's going to end. And actually, I think we have the ability here to turn that on its head and say, actually, we have the ability to completely reinvent how we do things for a long-term, sustainable, good quality future for society, industry, humanity, to get very evangelical about it. But and from a financial point of view, we've touched upon the scale of the investment that is required. Well, that's scale of opportunity as well as challenge. And I think the energy side of things is obviously a vast component part of that decarbonisation journey. So it is right up there in terms of where focus needs to be.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, Matt. I think as difficult and as formidable as the problem is, I think I'm still quite excited by what's possible and what we can do. And again, just thinking about South Africa, so many of these solutions that we're thinking about give us benefits in various ways. And so here, in investing in renewables, in decentralizing energy infrastructure, also helps to resolve some of the institutional issues that the government has here. So ESCOM, the state energy provider, the massive corruption issues there at the moment. So not only do you then ensure energy self-sufficiency and stability, but you also take power away from institutions which aren't delivering for society at large. And so you get this double benefit by focusing on some of these issues which help us with climate risk as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry if I've put anyone on a downer, but I agree. Every challenge presents a great opportunity, and there's so much work being done in this space, so many new exciting technologies. Some of them are just blindingly simple, some of them are unbelievably complicated, but huge amounts of effort, and that effort and investment is only going to grow. So yeah, it's incredibly exciting space to be working in. So thank you so much, Clinton. Thank you very much indeed, Matt. Thank you, Pankaj. Are there anything else we should add to this, Pankaj, or before we wrap up?
This is fantastic. This is fantastic. And when we talk to many organizations, it's sometimes difficult to figure out whether they are talking about sustainability for the PR or they really care about sustainability, right? So it's good to see that there is the right focus on sustainability. In Clinton's world and in Matt's world, and obviously Faradai is doing so much for the sustainability in EMEA region and now in other geographies as well. So it's really great to see this whole initiative and all the different advancements that are happening. I really appreciate Clinton and Matt's time today. Their insights are extremely valuable. And I hope that we can keep reconnecting with each other to see what are the other collaboration opportunities that we have. Edward, I think you are a fantastic moderator. You do a fantastic job.
You're
so really glad to hear you again and see you again.
Must be very, very good at poker, Pankaj.
Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a good weekend.
Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Stay
Bye-bye.
warm, guys.